First, why do TV shows do cliffhangers in the first place? The answer is simple. It's so that you can grab the audience attention so that you can make them keep watching for the next episode. It makes perfect sense to try and reel in the audience's attention so that they continue watching the series you've created. The last thing anyone ever wants to do is make an audience gradually lose interest. So a common tactic that writers will do is make a cliffhanger, where there is essentially a thread hanging at the end of the plotline in order to ensure that the audience will want to keep watching more and find out what happens after that cliffhanger. This was a common tactic in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. It's still being used today because it is such a well-proven tactic for serials, where there is an overarching narrative, and in order to keep the audience invested in that narrative, you have to keep the audience interested in what happens next. But something that not enough people realize is that you can actually create a bad cliffhanger. Some people tend to think that cliffhangers are kind of clear and cut, where you just sort of cut away before an action sequence is about to begin and then say something along the lines of, "Next time on Dragon Ball Z." This is very common, but at what point do cliffhangers become a bad thing? At what point does a cliffhanger hurt your series? Now, Brandon Sanderson, if you get the chance, please watch his series if you're interested in learning how to write. He talks about how to actually do a cliffhanger. He actually presents a really good formula. I'm not sure if he made it himself, but either way, it's just very, very helpful in understanding how to properly do a cliffhanger. Brandon Sanderson talks about the yes, but, or no, and. What this is leaving the audience with something more to yearn for in order to keep the audience invested in your work. So what is this method of yes, but, no, and? What this is at the end of your plotline, you have to decide, does the character accomplish what they intended? If the answer is yes, add a but at the end. And if the answer is no, add an and at the end, where you continuously create more stakes for your character in order to continue your story. This is great for independent flow because some people who don't really like mapping out the future can use these tactics to keep writing their story. So this is essentially a perpetual cliffhanger angle that some writers choose to go by. Now, you're going to have to ask yourself at a certain point, how do I want this series to end? Do I ever want this series to end? Make sure you keep that in mind because sometimes you might want to just tie previous points together once you think you've found a good point to end your series. So, now I've told you one method of how to do a cliffhanger. It's important to ask, how do you make a bad cliffhanger? Now, for this series, I'm going to be using two different examples. One is from Rwby Volume 5, Chapter 7, which is the bad example of how not to do a cliffhanger. And then the Legend of Korra episode, Volume 4, Chapter 2, where Korra meets with Toph. Now, think about what happened in the episode of Legend of Korra Chapter 2. By the way, I'm only spoiling this one episode. The rest won't be spoiled at all. Chapter 2 opens up with Korra trying to find something, or at least run away from something. You have a push and pull factor to her character. She is running away from this dark vision of herself, and at the same time, she is following a spirit in the hopes that she can gain answers. I've always liked this type of narrative because you have two different aspects. The running away aspect out of fear, and then the chasing aspect out of desire. This is a pretty good form of pushing a character forward. But I want you to think about the very ending of this episode. Right when she finally enters the cave and she's about to meet Toph. Let's replay it.
Feeling better?
Where am I? What happened?
I was hoping you could tell me. I found you passed out in the mud. What brings you to the swamp, anyway?
A spirit led me here and told me I was supposed to find someone. Is that you?
It's me. But if your avatar senses called you here, you should probably listen to them.
Wait, you recognize me?
In a manner of speaking. We were good friends in your previous life.
I can't believe it. Toph?
Nice to see you again, Twinkle Toes.
Alright, now think about what just happened. Korra finally meets Toph, and we actually get to see Toph on screen for the first time since the original Avatar The Last Airbender. This is a huge moment for the audience since she was a beloved character that we all like. Now, this was definitely a callback type of sequence in the story, but it fits well because this is what Korra has always needed. It is tied to her character and it helps the character. However, think about what the creators could have done in this episode. This could have ended with Korra saying Toph, and then the screen goes black. That would piss off the audience so much, but it would be a really great cliffhanger. So ask yourself, why did the writers decide to show Toph instead of cutting off before you got to see Toph's face? The answer is because the writers wanted to give us a reward for our wait. They wanted to give us a sense of accomplishment at the end of the episode. By the end of this episode, I'm sure a lot of the audience was cheering that we got to see Toph meet Korra for the first time. We enjoyed that sequence and we got a sense of accomplishment just by hearing Toph say Twinkle Toes. And the whole episode led up to a overwhelming conclusion. If they had cut in half, it would have been a very underwhelming conclusion and would not have been as exciting as seeing Toph in person on the screen like we've all been waiting. Now, a bad cliffhanger will typically have a poor setup. I'm going to get into 3 aspects of what makes a bad cliffhanger. 1 is bad build-up, 2 is bad pacing, and 3 is bad reward. For this example, I'll be using Rwby Volume 5, Chapter 7. At the end of Chapter 7, you have a scene where Mercury is about to enter the bandit camp and she withdraws her weapons in a very aggressive-like pose. And it's heavily implied there's going to be a fight scene in the next episode. Before I get into the next episode, let's talk about the episode as a whole. Generally, something I'm always going to emphasize is build up your narrative to a conclusion. The whole episode was more of a slice of life aspect of the show, where Rwby is reunited with Yang and Weiss, and that's alright. However, this whole sequence didn't do a lot to progress the story. It felt like filler, meaningless, and ultimately useless. Enjoyable, sure, but not tied to the plot itself. Because this whole episode, you probably could have cut it in half and had that lore explanation using half the time of the episode. It seems to me like it's a waste of time and it drags the audience more for unnecessary things because there is no plot progression. The reason I wanted to bring up this plot complaint is because the plot of the episode did not build up to the cliffhanger. What happened with Rwby's team has very little connection to Emerald reaching the bandit camp. And it will be relevant to them later on, absolutely. But my issue is that they aren't tied together. One is not a consequence of another. And because of that, it felt more like there were 2 storylines that were happening at the same time, and the whole episode didn't actually connect to the cliffhanger. Now, you can do multiple storylines, all connecting and interweaving as a main plot moves forward. You absolutely can do that. But I'm going to explain later why this episode was better off not having the cliffhanger at all. Now, number 1, there wasn't build-up. Number 2, the pacing ruined the cliffhanger itself. We were kind of left hanging there, and a lot of the audience were excited to expect a fight scene in the next episode. But when the next episode came, we didn't get the action scene we were all hoping for. Instead, we got into this calmer, serene scene where the characters of Rwby were talking again. And having a dialogue moment or a calming moment isn't a bad thing. You can have that, especially when things are in high intensity mode and you want to make the action die down a little. I understand that. But in this case, the cliffhanger built up our anticipation for this fight scene, and instead we got this episode that didn't provide a fight scene at all. The calming moment killed our anticipation for Mercury's fight scene as the episode dragged on longer and longer with these calm moments of Team Rwby. So what ends up happening is you ruin the pacing of the cliffhanger. The cliffhanger was setting us up for something, And now that you've given us a long dialogue scene, the mood has shifted. We have lost all sense of anticipation from the last episode. The cliffhanger has not given us the satisfaction that it's supposed to give us. The whole episode essentially ruined the pacing of the cliffhanger and makes the cliffhanger feel useless as a result. We were essentially lied to. We expected something and then we didn't get it. And by the end of episode 8, we were wondering, is this fight scene ever going to happen at all? We lost all our anticipation and we lost all of our expectation of a fight scene. So the pacing ruined the feeling of the cliffhanger. That's number 2. And number 3, which I think is actually the worst part of this cliffhanger, is that it didn't deliver us with the expectations we were waiting for. This is a huge disappointment to the audience because we were explicitly expecting a fight scene because the weapons were unsheathed. Team bad guy versus other team bad guy. We all wanted a fight scene, and the fight scene never happened at all. We had an expectation, and then we weren't delivered on that expectation. Essentially, you reeled us in and didn't even give us bait for the hook. Rwby, at its original series, was meant to be an action show, and then we didn't get the action when we were finally expecting it. And that's how this cliffhanger hurts the show more than it helps. Anticipation and cliffhangers are supposed to reel people in, but it only works if you keep satisfying the expectations that the audience has. If you do not satisfy those expectations, then you end up hurting your own show because it feels like you're lying to the audience. We all wanted an action scene and we didn't get that. We were tied down to a certain expectation and then the story did not live up to that expectation. What ends up happening is you end up disappointing your audience than if you didn't have that cliffhanger in the first place. A cliffhanger is meant to build up excitement and then satisfy that excitement in some way. Because we were left unsatisfied, we were only left disappointed, and as a result, we end up more upset at the series as a whole instead of if that cliffhanger weren't put in the first place. This cliffhanger, because it did not live to the expectations, hurt the show more than it helped. It ruined future expectations for episodes. Will there ever be an action scene? And you can argue that episode 7 had a bit of action, but that was minimal at best and not the choreography that most of us oftentimes miss. In this case, if Rwby is going to change genres, do not set up promises of fights only to knock them down later. That will only lead to more and more disappointment of the show. This cliffhanger of Mercury entering the bandit camp ended up hurting the show more than it helped. The same thing happened in Volume 5, Chapter 4. Weiss and Yang finally reunited and were about to take down a bandit camp. The show was setting up for a fight scene, and by all means, we were expecting a fight scene. A lot of us had hoped that a fight scene would finally occur in Rwby, because this fight scene would have been relevant to the plot. But instead, as the music hit its climax, as Weiss made its summoning and Yang was about to fight by her side, Raven stops the fight before it can even start. Music stops. All the expectation and excitement that we were set up for disappears as the fight never happens. You could have easily made a short fight scene and then Raven stopping the fight later by telling her men to stand down. And if production is the issue, which I'm sure it is, I fully understand that 3D animation is a difficult thing to produce. You cannot keep setting up empty promises and never following through with them. It will lead to more and more disappointment in the series, and you will actually end up losing more audience members than what you keep from fake cliffhangers. Don't do fake cliffhangers. Make sure your cliffhangers are honest to what you want the audience to see next in order to avoid false expectations and disappointment for the rest of your series. Rwby has quite a few writing issues, but this was something that needed its own video, and I feel that a lot of people don't understand what cliffhangers are for, and it's worth trying to understand. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to make more as they come. Suggestions are much appreciated. Thank you. Axel out.